Metal Gear is one of the single most influential franchises in the video game industry. The games were, of course, pioneers in the stealth genre, but they are also noteworthy for being some of the first games to use cinematic elements to tell a story. Metal Gear Solid, in particular, is of great significance, as it was one of the first times where one could say they got the same enrichment playing a video game that they would get from reading a book or seeing a movie. Seriously, the narrative told over the course of the six mainline entries was and still is one of the greatest stories ever told, and it's one that I revisit every couple of years. However, following the release of Metal Gear Solid 4, which put a pretty firm cap on the story, the franchise had a hard time finding the next path forward. Series creator Hideo Kojima had the right idea. Rather than try to continue the story that had already been finished, he opted to make games that focus more on gameplay, an approach that I suppose didn't result in the numbers Konami wanted because they would eventually mandate that Kojima make MGS5. Though this would result in one of the most polished stealth games of all time, this would cause some major friction between Kojima and Konami, resulting in MGS5 releasing in an unfinished state and Kojima parting ways with Konami for good. A series of events that I'm sure Konami regrets as they found out very quickly that they needed Kojima far more than he needed them. Their first attempt at continuing the series without him, Metal Gear Survive, blew up in their face big time. It did so poorly and was so reviled by fans that the most Konami has done with the series at this point is use it for branding on pachinko machines. Then in 2005, it was announced that Konami was taking another crack at it with a remake of MGS3. I think I had the same reaction that a lot of fans had. Why MGS3? It seemed like an odd choice, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. It had been a while since the last Metal Gear game, so I'm sure Konami had concerns it would still resonate. Starting with the remake of one of the most beloved chapters in the original series was a good place to start, and with MGS3 being the earliest point in the timeline, it would be a good starting point for a line of remakes. Something I think would be good for all 6 of the original games, particularly the MSX games. However, I had my reservations. Konami does not have a good track record with making Metal Gear games without Kojima, and the trailer sort of gave off the impression that MGS Delta, as it would come to be called, would be a note-for-note remake of MGS3. I would have preferred that they take the original game to the next level, much like they did with the Silent Hill 2 remake, and sadly, that is not what we got with Delta. Look guys, I'm not gonna lie, Metal Gear Solid Delta is a complete waste of time. Now, before anyone comes from my head, I feel I should state for the record that MGSD is still a great game by all accounts. The story, the presentation, and aspects of the gameplay are still top-notch, but that is primarily because MGSD is a note-for-note remake of MGS3. Now, some might say that's a good thing, but considering that MGS3 is currently widely available via Konami's Metal Gear Solid Master Collection Volume 1, it really is a problem. Not to mention disrespectful to Kojima's work. Call this a faithful recreation of MGS3 if you want, but the game comes off to me as a group of young developers copying the work of a master without doing any of the creative work that could have made it their own. Needless to say, my opinions are not running high with this one, but let's take an honest look.
Commencing Operation Snake Eater.
The game takes place in 1964 and the Cold War is in full swing. The game centers around Naked Snake of the Fox Unit. The Fox Unit is a branch of the United States Army with the mission statement of conducting covert operations in enemy territory without leaving any trace of their presence. Obviously, the services of the Fox Unit would be useful in a war of espionage, but the unit still needs to prove itself. To do so, Snake is tasked with extracting Russian scientist named Sokolov, who was attempting to defect to the US but was brought back to Russia as part of a deal to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. They wanted Sokolov because he was working on a new weapon system that could change the power balance of the Cold War, hence why the US wants to get him back without the Soviet Union knowing. The mission goes off without a hitch, but ends in failure due to the sudden betrayal of the boss, a legendary WW2 vet who played a big hand in bringing the war to an end and Snake's former mentor. She recaptures Sokolov and turns him over to a group colonel named Volkan, who plans on using Sokolov's new weapon to seize power in Russia. To make matters worse, the boss gifted Volkan a pair of Davy Crockett nuclear rifles, one of which he used to destroy Sokolov's research facility. Obviously, an American nuke being set off on Russian soil doesn't look good for the United States. Thankfully, this was a time in history where the leaders of Russia and the US were actually interested in peace, maggots, so the Russians make a deal with the United States. They will acknowledge the US's innocence if they kill the boss. A very tall order considering the boss is recognized as the single greatest soldier who has ever lived. Being her last pupil, Snake is deemed the only soldier who stands even a remote chance against the boss, and thus he is sent back to Russia to do the deed, while also foiling the plans of Colonel Volgin. The plot of MGS3 is one of the best chapters in the whole series. Its plot is complex and engaging, its characters are deep and interesting, the way it juggles its genres is great, and it stands out from the rest of the series with the events of the game occurring to the backdrop of the Cold War. The action sequences are thrilling, the villains are straight out of a comic book, and the emotional moments still resonate today. It's a story that has not aged a day in its life, and it's one that I'm sure to revisit again in the future. So then, why is it I feel let down by this story? Now, I had my thoughts on what a remake of MGS3 should be, but the one thing that I didn't want to see tampered with was the story. However, upon revisiting the story, I felt there was some wasted potential in regards to how the story is told. MGS3 is distinctly a Hideo Kojima game in that while the plot and themes are stone cold serious, the way it's told is very over the top, with comic book style villains, long stretches of dialogue, and expressive body language. And while I still enjoy that style, I couldn't help but view it as a little silly at times. One thing I would have liked to have seen is the plot of MGS3 reinterpreted via the storytelling style of a new director. Make it a little more grounded, a little less flamboyant, and let the visuals do the heavy lifting rather than the dialogue. Maybe even try to work the story into the gameplay a little bit more. I guess you could say I was looking for something along the lines of how the remakes of Resident Evil 2 or Silent Hill 2 were handled. Now I know what people are going to say in defense of this game. If they had changed anything, then it would have been disrespectful to Kojima's original vision. And I have to call bullshit on that, especially considering that Kojima himself has stated that he will not be playing this game. Something that the development team has stated disappoints them, but believe me, they do not want to know what Kojima would have to say about this game. The game that they have touted as a faithful re-envisioning of Metal Gear Solid 3 that captures the core experience of the original game. But it is little more than a note-for-note remake of the original game. It's not so much a respectful representation of his work, it's an imitation of his work that this development team will likely use to further their own career with little effort. You don't have to stick so closely to the original game when you are doing a remake like this. Resident Evil 2 and Silent Hill 2 made changes to every aspect of the storytelling with their respective remakes, yet they still worked because the general plot structure and thematic content was still there. It felt like I was experiencing the story in a new way, whereas MGSD felt like a game I have played a dozen times already. Granted, if you are a new player who has never experienced the story before, you will be in for one hell of a treat, but the primary demographic for this game is going to be people like me who are familiar with the series and the original game, so I'd say the amount of people who are going to get anything out of it are going to be very slim. The only thing that is really done up from the original MGS3 is the graphics, and even in that respect, the game isn't that impressive. Yeah, the character models are crisp and clean, all those off-ball PS2 quirks are gone, and all the new graphical effects are cool, but it isn't long before the wow factor wears off. This is primarily because MGS3 was already a pretty damn good looking game, especially for its time, so the bump in presentation really isn't that noticeable. Especially considering how many times MGS3 has already been remastered. Not helping matters is the fact that the visuals are really the only thing they have addressed. I was hoping that they would make the game one big seamless experience, but the game still operates on its 7-minute structure and doesn't up the size and scale of everything in a manner that it should. And don't give me any of that nonsense about these being deliberate design choices made by Kojima for artistic reasons. These were design choices made to accommodate hardware limitations that no longer exist. It would be like if for a RE2 remake, they still use pre-rendered backgrounds, tank controls, and have every room be separated by a loading screen. You have more powerful hardware, guys. Use it. The sound design is equally disappointing. Now, it's not to say that the audio was bad here. MGS3 had some great sound design with excellent sound effects, exceptional music, and one of the best voice casts in all the gaming. It was so good that the developers decided to use most of it for the remake. I guess Konami learned from their mistakes that resulted in the loss of Silent Hill 2's source code, so they must have kept everything related to MGS3 so that they could clean it up for something like this. I guess that should be commended, but it still comes off as lazy. I'm sure there are some new aspects of the sound design, but I couldn't tell you what they are. It's a strong looking game, but only because the original game was such a strong looking and sounding game. It was because of Kojima that this is so good, not so much the team behind this game.
You ejected the first bullet by hand, didn't you? I see what you were trying to do. But testing a technique you've only heard about in the middle of battle wasn't very smart. You were asking to have your gun jam on you. Besides, I don't think you're cut out for an automatic in the first place. You tend to twist your elbow to absorb the recoil. That's more of a revolver technique.
Okay, full disclosure, I have never been the biggest fan of MGS3 in regards to gameplay. Now, it's not to say that MGS3 is bad, but there are some elements that I feel could have been better. The controls and camera, which carried over from MGS2, were mismatched to the outdoor setting. The level design was a little too sloppy and led to a much slower pace than the previous games, and the survivor menu further bogged down the pace due to how much time you spent in the menu. MGS3 is far from a perfect game, and while I have my issues with MGS1 and 2, I tend to see more flaws with MGS3. So imagine my frustration to find that nothing was done to address these issues. First up, the controls. Some may say that they fix the camera, but they fix that with the subsistence version of the game, so no credit is due there. Some may say they fix the aiming by adding over-the-shoulder aiming, but they added that to the 3DS version of the game, so that's not worthy of much credit either. I guess it is nice that you can now use that aiming system with an analog stick instead of buttons, but it's nowhere near as polished as it is in Metal Gear Solid 4 or 5. Hell, MGS-D feels like a step backwards from 4 and 5. All the different ways they added for Snake to move around those games was stripped out. Why? It added depth to the gameplay and made you feel like you had more control over Snake. Hell, even here the controls don't feel as polished as they should be. When you are just sneaking around, it's fine, but whenever you have to do anything under pressure, it feels finicky and imprecise. The hell, guys? Now, I know what some people will say in defense of this. If they added all the new movement options from 4 and 5, it would break the game because the level design was not designed around the added movement options. That is actually a fair point, and we actually have an example of that happening within the Metal Gear series with the Twin Snakes. However, here's my counter argument. If that is the case, change the level design to accommodate the added movement options. Let me ask you guys a question. If Kojima were to remake MGS3 himself, do you think he would keep the controls as is? No, he'd try to work in as many innovations that he incorporated into later games as possible, and if that meant changing the level design, he would. Besides, the level design in MGS3 isn't very good to begin with. It makes for a very slow pace, the enemy placement can be obnoxious, and sometimes it's unclear how you're supposed to get by without being detected. It was Kojima's first attempt at making a stealth game that takes place in the wilderness instead of an urban environment, and that shows as MGS4 and 5 had vastly superior pacing and level design. There was room for improvement here, yet they chose not to change anything out of respect for Kojima's original vision. The slow pacing brings us nicely to the survival menu. I have always hated this aspect of MGS3. Now by design, stealth games have a slow pace. Games like this always involve a high degree of weighing around, observing patterns, and trying to figure out the best way to slip by. However, in previous games, Kojima was able to keep these issues to a minimum due to concise level design, guards that move at a brisk pace, and simpler mechanics. MGS3 sports more expansive level design, guards that tend to linger, and it leans too heavily into more advanced tactics, namely the camo index. So that stop and go gameplay is much slower than previous games, and made worse by the survival menu. See, in addition to the standard health bar, you have a stamina meter. It drops naturally over time and drops faster depending on what you do. To keep it up, you need to keep Snake fed, and you want to keep it up because low stamina will screw up your aim, give away your position to Snake's stomach growling. Okay, that's actually kind of funny, and it will cause him to heal slower. On that note, you also have to manually treat Snake's injuries in the survival menu. This takes forever compared to earlier games where all you had to do to keep Snake's health up was equip a ration and let it replenish your health when your health bar hits 0. It slows the pace of an already slow-paced game down even more, which is not a good thing. This was especially annoying during the Pain boss fight, which requires you to swim underwater to avoid damage. This rapidly drains your stamina, requiring you to hunt and consume fish while you're fighting a living beehive. And that's in addition to taking the time to treat your injuries if you take damage. It's not realistic, it's not immersive. If anything, it takes you out of the experience. And once again, I know what people are going to say. They didn't remove the survival menu out of respect for Kojima's original vision. Did Kojima use the survival menu in later games? No, he did not. He chose to get rid of it because it was a pace breaker. He saw it as a problem, and he fixed it. He probably would have taken it out if he were to remake this game himself. At the very least, it is nice that they took the time to have a quick camo system, whereas before you had to open up the survival menu to change out your fatigues. Shame they didn't simplify the rest of the survival menu like that. Is this the best version of MGS3? Oh, undeniably. Simply by virtue of the fact that you now have over-the-shoulder aiming and an analog stick to play with. However, that's small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. The complex aiming from the original game was only a minor issue in light of the many other issues that MGS3 had. Issues that they made no effort to fix here, and I can't really say it's much better than Subsistence as a result.
The dead are not silent. Now you will know the sorrow of those whose lives you had ended.
Like any good stealth game, MGS3 is really only difficult if you are a dumbass. If you play things smart and think creatively, you should be able to get by without much issue. However, there are some annoyances. For starters, the stealth system can be a little buggy. I noticed several times where I was spotted despite being pretty far away and out of sight, and with the high camo index, which I don't recall happening much in the original game. The segments where you need to use a disguise are also pretty buggy. Any part of the game that requires you to engage in combat is pretty bad in general, outside of the boss fights. And even then, some of the boss fights have some issues. I already talked about all the issues with the Pain boss fight, but I for whatever reason struggle with the Fury big time here as well. Not sure why, considering that has always been one of the easier boss fights to my recollection. I also feel like they made the fight with the boss a little too easy, with it being very clear when you were supposed to CQC her. All that being said, this is still a pretty balanced stealth game, and there are some great boss fights as well. The End and Sorrow boss fights are still some of the best in the whole series. MGSD clocks in about 6 to 8 hours, so the game isn't any longer or shorter than the original game. There's still plenty of replay value too, with multiple difficulty settings, Easter eggs to seek out, and lots of New Game Plus goodies to play around with. They even included the Snake vs. Monkey / Bomberman mode, which is cool. I'm surprised there's no MGS Online though, considering how financially exploitable that would have been for Konami. I'll bet they are kicking themselves for not including it though, because no matter how you slice it, MGSD is overpriced. The game is currently being sold at $70, which is a terrible price considering you can get the MGS Master Collection for $40. At that price, you'd be getting 5 of the 6 mainline Metal Gear games, which includes MGS3, or if you really want the MGS3 stuff, you can get the game individually for $20. Slight control and graphical improvements are not enough to justify a $30 to $50 upcharge. I suggest waiting for a price drop on this one. I doubt it's going to stay at full price for very long.
To capitalism.
I didn't go into MGSD looking for reasons to dislike it. Speaking honestly, I didn't even dislike it that much. It's honestly kinda hard for me to bring myself to say I hate anything related to the Metal Gear Solid series, and though I have been critical of MGSD, I am happy that it's doing so well at retail. At the time of writing this, Konami has stated that over 1 million copies of the game were sold within its first week, and that makes me happy because it'll probably mean we'll see more Metal Gear in the near future. However, that's part of what concerns me so much. Though MGSD is fine, it doesn't exactly represent the direction I want the series to take. I don't want note-for-note remakes like this. I want new versions of these games that improve and build upon the originals. Specifically, what I want are remakes of the original MSX games because they are the 2 chapters in the series that most people have not gotten to experience and likely will not experience because of how antiquated they are. That feels like the next logical step, but considering how little effort was put into MGSD, I get the sense that Konami isn't interested in remaking a game from scratch, which they would have to do if they wanted to remake the first Metal Gear. My guess is that their next course of action will be to remake Metal Gear Solid, and if they approach it in the same way they did MGSD, then that's going to be a legit travesty. Or who knows, maybe they'll try to take another crack at doing a brand new Metal Gear game. I'm not sure what they could possibly do to continue the series apart from doing a new Rising Revengeance game, but I'm open to a surprise. To make a long story short, Metal Gear Solid Delta might be MGS3 as I have always known and loved it, but that's precisely why at the end of the day, I don't recommend it.